In 1948, a man could walk into the woods with a wool blanket, a hatchet, and a pocket full of matches, and come home a week later, warm, fed, and dry. Today we spend $400 on gear that does what he did with his two hands. But here is the twist. Most of what your grandfather knew was never written down. It was shown once around a fire and expected to stick. Number 14 on this list was taught in every scouting handbook until the 1970s, then quietly dropped. And number 3 could carry you through a storm that sends modern campers running for their trucks. These skills did not vanish because they stopped working. They vanished because a store started selling the substitute. Before we start, hit that subscribe button because some of this might save your life someday. Let us count down. Number 25. Reading the sky before the storm. Your grandfather did not check a phone. He stepped outside at dusk, licked a finger to the wind, and read the clouds like a newspaper. High wispy mare's tails meant rain within a day. A ring around the moon meant moisture moving in. Smoke that hung low instead of rising told him the pressure was dropping and weather was coming. He watched the birds, too, when they flew low and the cattle lay down. He pulled the canvas tight and dug his trenches deeper. This was not superstition. It was decades of quiet observation passed from his own father. A man who could read the sky got his firewood under cover an hour before the first drop fell. The rest of the camp scrambled in the dark. We traded that patient watching for a radar app that dies the moment the signal does. Number 24, banking the fire for morning. Waking to a dead, cold fire pit was a rookie's mistake, and your grandfather never made it twice. Before crawling into his bedroll, he raked the glowing coals into a tight pile, then buried them under a blanket of ash and a single thick, unsplit log laid on top. That ash acted like insulation, choking the fire down to a slow smolder that held heat for 8 or 9 hours. At first light, he brushed the ash aside, laid on a handful of dry tinder, and blew gently. A flame would leap up within seconds, no matches required. It saved fuel, it saved effort, and on a frozen morning it meant coffee was boiling before your fingers went numb. Modern campers let the fire die and start over cold every day, never knowing the banked coals were quietly keeping the whole night alive underneath the gray. Number 23. The pine bough bed. Sleeping straight on the ground steals your body heat and wrecks your back, and your grandfather knew it before anyone sold him a foam pad. He would cut armfuls of evergreen boughs, spruce, fir, or hemlock, and shingle them tip down against the earth, overlapping each layer like feathers so the springy branches faced up. 8 inches of that made a mattress that cradled the body, lifted him off the cold ground, and smelled like Christmas all night. The resin even kept some bugs away. A man could build one in 20 minutes with nothing but a hatchet. Today, we inflate a $200 sleeping pad that hisses flat by 3 in the morning when it finds a thorn. He never worried about a puncture because his mattress grew back on the tree every spring, free for the taking, in every forest in America. Number 22. Oiling the canvas. Before nylon and polyester, a tent was heavy cotton duck canvas, and keeping it dry was a skill in itself. Your grandfather would mix boiled linseed oil with a little turpentine and paint it into the weave, or rub the whole thing down with paraffin wax on a warm day. The treated fabric shed rain like a duck's back and breathed at the same time, so it never turned clammy inside the way a plastic tent does. He knew the one iron rule too: never touch the inside of the canvas during a downpour, because your finger would break the surface tension and start a leak right onto your face at 2 in the morning. That waxed canvas lasted 30 years and got handed down. We buy a synthetic tent that delaminates in 4 seasons and goes straight to the landfill, and we call that progress. Number 21. Putting a real edge on steel. A dull axe is more dangerous than a sharp one, and your grandfather could restore a razor edge with a flat stone and a little spit. He would spit on the whetstone, not oil spit, because it was always on hand, and work the blade in slow circles, feeling for the burr that told him the edge had turned. Then he flipped it and knocked the burr off the other side. For the axe he used a round file and a leather strop, finishing until the blade could shave the hair off his forearm. A sharp tool did the work with less swing, meaning less fatigue and fewer glancing blows off a log. This was a Sunday evening ritual by the fire, the soft scrape of steel on stone. Now we buy disposable blades and throw the whole tool away when it dulls, having never learned the meditative art of bringing an edge back to life. Number 20, the feather stick. When the wood was wet and the tinder was soaked, a lesser man gave up. Your grandfather pulled out his knife and made a feather stick. He would take a dry stick or split one open to reach the dry core and shave long, thin curls down its length without cutting them free, so they fanned out in a cluster of paper-thin wooden feathers. Those curls caught a spark where a solid stick never could, and one good feather stick could birth a fire in a drizzle. It took practice to get the blade angle right, thin enough to catch, not so thin they snapped off. Boys learned it before they learned to drive. It is nearly a lost art now, because we carry chemical fire starter cubes and lighter fluid, and we never learned that the fire we needed was hiding inside the wet wood the whole time. Number 19, the reflector fire. A campfire throws heat in every direction, which means most of it warms the empty forest behind you. Your grandfather fixed that by stacking a wall of green logs or flat stones on the far side of the fire, angled to bounce the heat back toward his shelter. With the reflector behind the flames and his lean-to in front, he sat in a pocket of warmth that let him sleep comfortably in near-freezing nights with nothing but a blanket. Build the reflector at a slight lean, and it pushed the heat downward onto his bedroll instead of letting it drift up into the sky. This one skill did the work of a modern sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees. We zip ourselves into synthetic cocoons now and never learn that a wall of stacked logs can turn an open fire into a furnace aimed right at you. Here is where it gets interesting. That humble cast iron Dutch oven, the same black pot your grandmother used on the stove, was the single most important cooking tool in an American camp for 200 years. Number 18, cooking in the bean hole. Loggers and trail crews across New England and the North Woods swore by the bean hole, and your grandfather learned it from them. In the morning he dug a pit, lined it with rocks, and burned a hot fire down to coals right inside the hole. Then he lowered in a covered cast iron pot packed with soaked beans, salt pork, molasses, and onion, shoveled the coals and hot earth back over the lid, and walked away to fish or fell timber all day. That buried oven cooked low and slow for 8, 10, 12 hours, and by supper the beans were falling apart, smoky and sweet, with no tending at all. It fed a whole crew from one pot. We have slow cookers now that do the same thing on a countertop, but not one man in 100 could feed a camp from a hole in the ground the way he could. Number 17, Dutch oven baking with coals on top. The real magic of that iron pot was baking, and it looked like witchcraft to the uninitiated. Your grandfather could produce a golden biscuit, a peach cobbler, even a full loaf of bread in the middle of the wilderness, using nothing but coals. The trick was in the count. He placed a ring of hot coals under the oven and a heavier layer on the flat-rimmed lid, roughly twice as many on top as underneath, so the heat baked from both directions like a real oven. He rotated the pot and the lid a quarter turn every so often to beat the hot spots. A cobbler came out bubbling, the crust browned to perfection. Campers today heat a foil pouch on a propane burner and call it cooking, never tasting the crackling crust that cast iron and hardwood coals made together over 100 years of American camps. Number 16. The hobo stove from a tin can. During the Depression, your grandfather or his father learned to make a stove from garbage, and it worked so well he never stopped. He took a large tin can, punched a ring of holes around the bottom for air, and a doorway in the side to feed sticks, and turned it upside down as a cooktop. A tiny handful of twigs fed through the door, burned hot and clean, boiling a cup of coffee with fuel you could gather in 1 minute off the forest floor. No white gas, no propane canister, no cost at all. The holes created a chimney draft that made a few sticks roar like a furnace. It cooked a whole breakfast and packed flat in a rucksack. We spend $80 on a titanium backpacking stove and a fuel canister that runs out at the worst moment, doing exactly what a soup can did for free. Number 15. Finding and cleaning water. Your grandfather did not carry a plastic filter that clogs, and he rarely got sick because he knew where clean water hid. He looked for springs seeping from a hillside, running water over rock rather than still ponds, and the bright green plants that mark a hidden source. When the water was murky, he built a filter in a bandana or a hollow log, layering grass, sand, and crushed charcoal from his own fire, and let the water trickle through slow. The charcoal pulled the taste and much of the foulness out. Then he boiled it hard for a full minute over the coals, the oldest and surest purification there is. He read the land for water the way we read a map. We depend on a pump filter cartridge, and when it fails in the backcountry, most people have no idea that a fire and a handful of sand could have saved them. Number 14. The taut line hitch. This was the knot in every scouting handbook until the plastic tent buckle made it seem old-fashioned, and losing it was a quiet tragedy. The taut line hitch is a sliding, gripping knot that holds firm under tension but slides free when you need to adjust it, perfect for a tent guy line. Your grandfather threw one in the dark by feel, tightening his rig as the canvas sagged in the night rain, then loosening it in the morning damp when the ropes shrank tight. He knew 4 or 5 knots the way you know your own signature, the bowline that never slips or jams, the clove hitch, the sheet bend to join 2 ropes. A man with rope and knots could build almost anything. We buy tents with pre-sewn plastic clips that snap in the cold, having never learned the handful of knots that could rig a shelter out of a tarp and a length of cord. Number 13. Trenching the tent. It looks like extra work until the storm hits, and then it is the difference between a dry night and a flood. Before the first cloud, your grandfather walked the ground around his tent and dug a shallow trench a few inches out from the walls, sloping downhill and away, with a little channel to carry the water off toward lower ground. When the rain came in sheets, the runoff hit that trench and ran around the tent instead of pooling under his bedroll. He picked his campsite the same careful way, never in a low spot or a dry creek bed, always on a slight rise. This was 15 minutes of digging that saved a miserable, soaking night. Modern campgrounds discourage it, and modern campers skip it, then wake in a puddle, never knowing that a spade and a little foresight kept whole families dry for generations. Now, here is where things get controversial, because the next skill is one modern outfitters would rather you forget entirely. Number 12. Fire from flint and steel. Long before butane lighters, your grandfather could make fire from a rock and a piece of high-carbon steel, and he practiced it until it was automatic. He struck the steel down against a sharp edge of flint or quartz at a steep angle, showering tiny burning shavings of metal into a nest of waiting char cloth. One glowing spark, cupped in dry tinder and blown into life, became a flame. He kept the flint and steel in a small tin with his tinder, dry no matter the weather. This was insurance that never ran out of fuel and never failed in the cold the way a lighter does at altitude. It demanded patience and a steady hand. We flick a disposable lighter that cracks in freezing temperatures and empties without warning, having never learned that two hard objects and a spark were all our ancestors ever needed. Number 11. Making char cloth. Here was the secret ingredient behind the flint and steel, and almost nobody makes it anymore. Your grandfather took scraps of pure cotton cloth, an old worn-out shirt, and packed them into a small tin with a tiny hole punched in the lid. He set the tin in the edge of the fire and watched the smoke pour out of that hole. When the smoke stopped, the cloth inside had charred without burning to ash, turning into a black, fragile fabric that caught a spark instantly and held a coal. That was char cloth, and a good spark landing on it would glow and spread every time. It was the difference between a fire in one strike and an hour of frustration. This little bit of preparation, made by the fire the night before, was old wilderness wisdom. Now the knowledge lives in a few hobbyists and history books, gone from the general memory entirely. Number 10. Bannock on a stick. When the bread ran out 3 days into a trip, your grandfather did not go hungry. He carried flour, baking powder, salt, and a little fat or powdered milk, and from that he made bannock, the trail bread of trappers and mountain men. He mixed a stiff dough right in the top of his flour sack, wrapped a ribbon of it around a peeled green stick, and turned it slowly over the coals until it baked golden and hollow sounding. Peel it off the stick, and there was hot, fresh bread, crisp outside and soft in the middle, ready for butter or jam or dunking in stew. A few pennies of dry ingredients made bread anywhere, forever, with no oven. We haul in vacuum-sealed bagels that go stale and moldy by day 4, never knowing that a bag of flour and a green stick can produce warm bread over a fire every single night. Number 9. Smoking and salting the catch. With no cooler and no ice, your grandfather could keep a good catch of fish or a batch of game from spoiling in the summer heat. He built a low, smoky fire of green hardwood, rigged a simple rack of sticks above it, and hung thin strips of salted meat or filleted fish in the cool smoke for hours. The salt drew out the moisture, and the smoke sealed the surface, preserving the food for days without refrigeration, and adding a rich flavor no store could match. On a long trip, this meant a successful morning of fishing fed the party for the rest of the week. It was preservation and cooking in one patient, watchful process. We toss everything in a plastic cooler that turns to lukewarm water by the second afternoon, having lost the old knowledge of how to make food keep itself. Number 8. Everything from a cattail. Your grandfather looked at a marsh full of cattails and saw a whole supply depot. The fluffy brown heads made instant tinder that caught a spark like gasoline and stuffed a pillow or lined a boot for warmth. The green shoots and the roots were food, starchy and filling when boiled. The long leaves, split and dried, wove into cordage, mats, and makeshift shelter thatch. Even the pollen could thicken a stew. He knew a dozen wild plants like this: willow bark for aches, birch bark that lit wet. But the cattail was the general store of the swamp. This was folk knowledge built up over generations of paying attention. Today, most people cannot name 3 useful wild plants, and we walk past a marsh full of food, fire, and rope without recognizing a single resource in it. Number 7. Navigating without a compass. Your grandfather rarely got lost because the whole sky and forest were his map. By day, he could find south by pointing the hour hand of his watch at the sun and splitting the angle to the 12. He read the land. Streams run downhill toward civilization, and knew that moss grows fuller on the damp north side of a tree more often than not. At night he found the North Star by following the pointer stars off the Big Dipper, a fixed point that never moved all night. He noted a landmark behind him every so often, so the trail home looked familiar in reverse. This was situational awareness, a constant quiet reading of the world. We stare into a glowing phone that loses signal under the canopy and dies in the cold, having never learned that the sun and the stars have guided people home for 10,000 years. Number 6. Splitting kindling safely with a baton. Swinging an axe at a small stick in the dark is how men lost fingers, and your grandfather had a safer way. He set his knife or hatchet edge on top of the log he wanted to split, then struck the back of the blade with a heavy stick, a baton, driving it down through the wood in a slow, controlled crack. This was batoning, and it let him split precise, dry kindling from the heart of a wet log with no dangerous swinging at all. He could shave a big log down to pencil-thin sticks that lit in a drizzle, working close to the ground with total control. It kept 10 fingers on 10 hands around a lot of campfires. We buy bundles of kiln-dried firewood at the gas station now, wrapped in plastic, and never learned the calm, controlled skill that turned a soaked forest into a fire. Number 5. Twisting cordage from the land. When the rope ran short, your grandfather made more. He stripped long fibers from the inner bark of a dead but sound tree, from dogbane, or from the tough leaves of a yucca or cattail, and twisted them into strong 2-ply cord by rolling them along his thigh and letting them wind back on themselves. Reverse wrap it right, and the cord got stronger the harder you pulled. With it, he lashed a shelter frame, rigged a snare, mended a pack strap, or strung a fishing line. Rope was too valuable to run out of, so he learned to grow his own from whatever grew nearby. This was one of the oldest human skills, older than metal, older than the wheel. We carry a spool of nylon paracord and toss it when it frays, never knowing the ground beneath our boots is woven through with all the rope we could ever need. Number 4. The wool blanket bedroll. Before the mummy bag, your grandfather slept warm across the country with nothing but wool. He knew wool holds its heat even when it is damp, unlike the cotton and down that fail you soaking wet. He folded a large wool blanket into a bedroll, using an old blanket fold that wrapped over and tucked under so it could not flap open in the night, sometimes rolling a second blanket inside for a bitter cold snap. Wrapped in wool with a reflector fire at his feet and a bough bed beneath him, he was comfortable in weather that would put a modern camper in the hospital. That blanket doubled as a coat, a seat, and a stretcher in a pinch. We spend hundreds on a synthetic bag that is useless once it is wet, having forgotten that a simple gray army blanket kept soldiers and settlers alive through winters harder than we will ever see. Number 3. Building the survival shelter. This is the skill that carried men through the storm, that sent everyone else running for their trucks. With no tent at all, your grandfather could build a debris hut in an hour that would keep him alive in freezing rain. He leaned a long ridgepole against a stump, ribbed it with sticks like the spine of a fish, then piled on 2 or 3 feet of dry leaves, ferns, and forest debris until it was a thick, insulating mound. Inside, he stuffed more dry leaves to nest in, and his own body heat filled the small space and held. No fabric, no poles, no cost, just the forest floor built into a warm cocoon. This was the difference between surviving a lost night in the woods and not surviving it. Almost nobody carries this in their head anymore, and it is the one skill that has actually saved lives when everything else failed. Number 2. Reading and building the fire itself. More than any single trick, your grandfather understood fire as a living thing that had to be built in stages. He started with a nest of the finest tinder, added a tiny teepee of pencil-thin kindling, and only fed it thicker wood once the flame stood on its own, never smothering a young fire with a big log. He knew the fire lays for the job, the teepee for a quick blaze, the log cabin for steady cooking coals, the long fire for warming a whole group. He arranged his wood to dry by the flames before it went in, and he read the coals to know when the oven was ready. This patient, staged understanding is what separates a warm camp from a smoking, sputtering mess. We douse a pile of logs in lighter fluid and wonder why it will not catch, having never learned that fire is built, not lit. And finally, number 1, the whole thing carried in his head. The greatest forgotten skill was not any single trick, but the way it all lived together in one man's memory, ready without a single tool. Your grandfather could be dropped in the woods with a knife and a blanket and build a camp that most of us could not build from the back of a fully loaded truck. He read the weather, chose the ground, dug the trench, built the shelter, made the fire, found the water, and cooked the meal, and none of it came from a screen or a store. It came from being shown once around a fire by a man who had been shown the same way. That chain of knowledge, handed down through hands and firelight for generations, was the real gear. When we started buying the substitute for every skill, we quietly stopped passing the skills along. And a whole way of belonging in the wilderness went with them. That is the list. These 25 skills were not lost because they failed. They were lost because it got easier to buy the answer than to learn it. Your grandfather knew. Now you know too. Pick one this weekend. Build a feather stick, bank a fire, tie a taut line hitch, and tell me in the comments how it went. Because the fastest way to bring these back is to do them.